This video lecture will be covering Chapter 13 in Psychological Disorders, specifically schizophrenia and the other disorders. So now we're going to move into looking at schizophrenia. So when we're talking about schizophrenia and we're thinking about the brain, understand that this is a mental illness that kind of robs a person of their thoughts. But now within psychology, we have a new understanding about schizophrenia in terms of neuroscience. And with neuroscientists, they're studying brains of those who have passed on that was diagnosed or considered to have schizophrenia. Pretty much what research has been able to demonstrate is how the brain cells kind of sprouted out in abnormal connections that pretty much would affect the way schizophrenics would think. So what you need to know is that it's one of the most widespread type and devastating forms of mental disorders. Approximately 1 out of every 100 people will pretty much be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia usually starts up in the late teens and up into the mid ranges of the 30s, and it can be equally prevalent within men and women. But it's generally going to be more severe and strikes earlier in men than it would in women. Now, a lot of people confuse schizophrenia with the dissociative identity disorder. Remember, we've referred to that again as multiple personality disorders, or as people saw the movie Split. So think back to when we did the Mythbusters and talked about that. And the reason why there's some confusion when they think about split, because schizophrenia actually means split mind. However, when Eugen Buehler coined this term back in 1911, he was kind of referring more to fragmenting of thought processes and emotions, not the personality construct. So as we get more further in the chapter, I'll talk a little bit more about dissociative identity disorder again and look at the rarity of that condition of having more than one distinct personality. So now let's look at the 5 areas of disturbance in schizophrenia. First one would be perception. And here we're speaking about the senses of a person that is diagnosed with schizophrenia. It can be either enhanced or it can be blunted. And more or less, this is where that filtering and selection processes that allows most of us to be able to concentrate whatever we choose, this is impaired, okay? And that sensory stimulation for a person who's schizophrenic would be jumbled and distorted. Individuals with schizophrenia, they can also experience hallucinations. As mentioned before, there's several types of hallucinations, that being auditory, which would be the more common form of hallucinations, but you also have visual hallucinations in which a person may see things that no one else sees, as well as tactile hallucinations. And tactile hallucinations, I'm simply talking about touch here. For that, a person might feel like they have spiders crawling on them. That's more one of those common. These are rare types of hallucinations, but a lot of people who have said they feel something crawling within them or on them and no one else sees it or can feel it. I mentioned there was a good example of that in the TV show New Amsterdam, in which they had a child who was demonstrating tactile hallucinations. Just to give you an example. But going back to the main common one, I want you just to remember that the most common form of hallucinations for a person experiencing schizophrenia would be the hearing of voices and sounds, which are auditory. Now, there's going to be rare occasions where people with schizophrenia, they may hurt others in response to their to these type of distorted perceptions. But a person with schizophrenia they'll be more likely to be self-destructive and suicidal rather than violent toward others. Not saying that it's impossible. There are occasions that it has occurred where they may be a harm to others, but more times than not, they are going to be more apt to hurt themselves rather than someone else. Now, in terms of language and thought, for people with schizophrenia, words lose the usual meanings that we would have as well as the associations. A person with schizophrenia, their logic right now, is going to be impaired, and their thoughts will demonstrate as disorganized as well as bizarre. So with language and thought disturbances and they're mild, a person, they might jump from topic to topic. They can have two types. There's circumstantial type of speech as well as tangential speech. With circumstantial speech, sometimes they just keep going on and on and on, whereas with tangential type of speech, here they're going to be jumping from topic to topic. Now, in more severe disturbances, the person may actually start jumbling up phrases and words and putting them together into what we call word salads. Now, this is when they're creating artificial type of words. Like, for example, say chicken and coat, and they'll look at you and say, "But your coat." And with your coat, okay, we know that's not a word. So they may have a total new language of their own because they are melding words together that really do not go along. But the most common and more frightening type of thought disturbance that can be experienced with someone with schizophrenia would be that lack of contact with reality. They've lost a sense of reality, and this is what we call psychosis. So one form of that can be delusions, and delusions are going to be more common with people with schizophrenia, diagnosed with schizophrenia. So we all experience exaggerated thoughts from time to time, like thinking that a friend might be talking behind our backs, or they're trying to avoid us. We get those kind of thoughts in our minds every once in a while. Wow. However, when it comes to delusional thinking, schizophrenia, it can be so much more extreme. A person with schizophrenia may falsely believe that a postman, for example, who usually deliver mail to their house every single afternoon, may all of a sudden be conspiring to kill them, and it would likely qualify them as having delusions of persecution. I think I mentioned earlier that during my experiences at Mississippi State Hospital, I had a gentleman who felt that I was trying to steal his husband away from him. And as long as the delusions were strong in him, you couldn't tell him otherwise. And one thing I do want to mention is that when it comes to delusions, and as far as the treatment and providing interventions, we never try to just tell a person who's suffering from delusions that it doesn't exist, that that's not real. You want to try to help them gain insight on their own during these times by demonstrating and showing. In my case, for that individual, I actually, at the time that I was working with that particular patient, I wasn't married at that time. So I had to actually go out. I had to go buy a wedding band, and I had to cut out a picture from a magazine and show him that I was already married, and thus I wasn't trying to steal his husband. And that kind of placated and allowed him to say, well, okay, she's not trying to steal my husband after all. In terms of delusions, when we're talking about delusions of grandeur, now this is when people believe that they're someone extremely important. They might think they're God, for example, or they can think that they're the Queen of England. In terms of talking about delusions of reference, this is when we're talking about those unrelated events at any given special significance, as when you're giving him or her a special message. You can look at that person and all of a a sudden they're saying, okay, you're telling me this. So these are just some types of the delusions that are present for individuals with schizophrenia. Okay, so the next one we're going to speak about is emotion. Now, there's going to be changes in emotion, and it'll usually occur with people in schizophrenia. In some cases, the emotions, they might appear exaggerated as well as rapidly fluctuating. There'll be other times when a person's emotions, they can appear extremely blunted. So individuals with schizophrenia, they may have, a flattened affect. And a flattened affect, when we say that, we're talking about they're demonstrating no emotional response of any kind. A person may just all of a sudden go, and you can speak to them, you can say things to them, and there's no true response, or you don't see any real emotions amongst them. As they might be conversing with you, or they may not even say a word. Okay. In terms of behavior, which is the last one, behavior disturbances, it could take the form of unusual actions and it will have special meaning. So one example might be that a patient massage his head repeatedly to be able to clear it of any unwanted thoughts. So people with schizophrenia, they might become cataleptic and assume nearly an immobile stance for extended periods of time. I'm trying to think of the name of the movie. This movie was with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, in which Robert De Niro played I think it was called Doc Adams. He was in a catatonic state, and he was cataleptic, and just no movement. And this was like this for years. And they were able to work with him, and they were slowly able to get him out of catatonia. However, unfortunately, the interventions that they used eventually didn't no longer work, and the patient's Robert De Niro's character, as well as a few others that they had, eventually went all back into a cataleptic state. But these are those 5 areas of disturbances. Please make sure that you double check and read and have a good understanding about those. Feel free to ask a question if you need to get some clarity on it. Now, we've for many years, research has divided schizophrenia into 5 subtypes. Those being paranoid. And paranoid, that's where we were talking about the delusional thinking, as well as those hallucinations. The catatonic that I was just talking about is where we're really speaking about those motor disturbances, that being immobility, or it could be purposeless activities, just stray spin or this type of movement. There can be agitation. They can have where they're repeating the speech of others, which we call echo speech. The disorganized, this is where I was talking about the word salad. You might see this incoherent speech. You might see that their emotions are going to be either exaggerated or flat or blunted, as well as socially be withdrawn. Undifferentiated. Now, this is when a person who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia pretty much shows symptoms along the entire spectrum. It's like it's varied. They'll meet criteria for schizophrenia, but we wouldn't put them in any of the first 3 categories, as they demonstrate all of them. And then there's what we call the residual category. And here is when they're no longer meeting the full criteria of schizophrenia. However, they still may demonstrate some of the symptoms that's involved. So we then have moved from that, and we have more of a new method of classifying it. Those are what we initially started with. Now, though, we look at what we say as positive symptoms, or negative symptoms. And with the positive symptoms, we're talking about those delusions or hallucinations, whether there are the additions or exaggerations as mentioned. The negative symptoms is talking about loss or absence. And here, are they able to still attend to things? Is there an impairment there? Is the speech patterns going to be limited or toneless, where we talked about the affect being flat or blunted? Do they become monotone? And then it goes the social withdrawal. And then again, finally, those distortions, they're undifferentiated. This is when we feel that's a disorganization, okay? Now, in terms of trying to explain schizophrenia, here, let's first start with the genetics and the biological factors. Although researchers have been able to identify specific genes that's going to be related to schizophrenia, most genetic studies have been able to focus more on twins as well as adoptions, okay? From that investigation, it's been suggested that the risk of schizophrenia really do increases with genetic similarity. That is, the more a person shares genes with another person, the more likely they might develop the disorder. So remember when I talked about identical twins compared to fraternal twins, of course we know that that's going to have a demonstration of increase. As well as in terms of adopting, although that the likelihood drops considerably, let's remember how we spoke about in earlier chapters, how living in a family line, although there's not a genetic link, there is those times when how one is reared, how one is raised, the involvement socially and the connections still can have an impact. In terms of neurotransmitters, precisely how genetic inheritance produces schizophrenia is still kind of unclear. According to the dopamine hypothesis, overactivity of certain dopamine neurons within the brain can cause schizophrenia. And this hypothesis is kind of based upon two different observations. That first one would be the administration of amphetamines that would increase the amount of dopamine, and then it helped to produce or make it worse for symptoms of schizophrenia, particularly with people that has a genetic predisposition for the disorder. The second one is talking about the drugs and how it reduced dopamine activity in the brain, and that reduction or elimination of symptoms of schizophrenia is how it can be influenced. Now, when we talk about brain abnormalities, this is that third major biological theory that comes about with schizophrenia, and it involves these abnormalities in the brain functioning as well as structure. Research has been able to find that people with that's been diagnosed with schizophrenia tend to have larger cerebral ventricles, and that's those fluid-filled spaces in the brain. So some people with schizophrenia may demonstrate that. Now, in terms of genetics, again, in schizophrenia, just remember biological relatives of people with schizophrenia is going to have a higher risk than those with the disorder during their lifetimes. The closer the relative, like I mentioned, is going to have more similar and will have a greater risk for those distant relatives. So that's why it's really important in terms of when we're working with individuals, when we first meet individuals and we're doing a psychological evaluation, we ask the questions about family history. This allows us to know which direction to be able to take in terms of knowing what possible predispositions may be present. So if, for example, I'm working with an individual and I ask them, has anybody demonstrated or showed any mental illness in your family? And they can say, well, my mother was schizophrenic. Then I automatically know that there's, a possibility that that's something that I would have to rule out or look at in terms of that particular patient or client. Now, a couple of things that we want to look at in as well would be the diathesis stress model of schizophrenia. Now, we've talked a lot about stress through the semester. Yes, stress can play a role, and it can be an essential role to triggering a schizophrenic episode for people that have that predisposition, or what they're saying here, diathesis of the disease. There are some researchers that have suggested that communication disorders within family dynamics, it has also been a predisposing factor for schizophrenia. And such disorders can include the unintelligible type speech, fragmented communication, as well as parents frequently sending severely contradictory messages to their children. Other studies have suggested to have a greater rate of relapse and worsening of symptoms among hospitalized patients who went home to their families that were critical or hostile toward them, or has been overly involved in their lives emotionally. So, how should we evaluate the different theories about the causes of schizophrenia? Critics of the dopamine hypothesis and the brain damage theory, they would argue that the theories fit only some cases of schizophrenia. More so, with both theories, it's kind of difficult to determine cause and effect. The disturbed communication theories, on the other hand, are going to be hotly debated, and research here has been the result of a combination of known as well as unknown interacting factors. So there's a strong evidence that links schizophrenia to biological, psychological, as well as social factors. And again, when we combine those three, it's called the biopsychosocial model. So here's a time to start working and getting and seeing if you're having clarity. What I would love for you to do is you're going to pause the video and just ask yourself these questions and see if you can answer these for yourself. Then, based upon what you've heard in the lecture, or utilize your textbooks, check the answers for yourself and see if you was able to get them right. Be able to see if you can list 3 biological and 2 psychosocial factors that would contribute to schizophrenia. Okay? Look at schizophrenia as a form of what? Fill in that blank. Of course, I want you to be able to see you have your choices. What's the best answer for number 3? And again, look at for the choices for number 4 and see what's the best answers for number 4. This is going to help prep you for that exam that you're going to be taking. So go ahead and pause now, and then we'll move on. Now, here we're going to look at some other type of disorders. All right, so now we're going to talk more about the dissociative disorders. So the most dramatic psychological disorders would be considered the dissociative disorders. And there are several types of dissociative disorders, but all involve a splitting apart, that's the dissociation, of significant consciousness, parts of our consciousness, or memories. Individuals would dissociate from the core of their personality by failing to be able to remember past experiences. This is what we call dissociative amnesia. Okay, they might start wandering or leaving home. This is what we would say dissociative fugue. Or it could be by losing their sense of reality and then feeling estranged from their self. And that feeling estranged or pulling apart from themselves is what we call depersonalization. It also can be developing completely separate personalities. And again, that's what dissociative identity disorder is. And just remember, Dissociative identity disorder was once known as multiple personality disorder, but we now go by dissociative identity disorder. So the major force behind all of these disorders would be that need to escape from the anxiety that a person might be having that can have emanated through some type of traumatic situation. So think about, imagine witnessing a loved one's death in a horrible car accident, God forbid. But can you see how your mind might want to just get away from it all to help cope by blocking out the memory of the event? That's what dissociating is all about. So unlike most other kind of psychological disorders, the primary cause of dissociative disorders appear to be those external environmental variables somewhat, with little or no genetic influence at all. The most severe dissociative disorder is the dissociative identity disorder. And here you can have two separate and distinct personalities that will exist in a person at the exact same time. And no, they're not going to automatically realize that they have several different personalities. Each personality would have their own unique memories. They're going to possess their own behaviors as well as social relationships. And the transition from one personality to another, it usually happens suddenly, and it's going to often be triggered by that psychological stress. Now, usually the original personality, their amount of awareness is very little to none in terms of when it happens. They really don't know about it. You generally won't know about alternate personalities that's happening, but all of the personalities may become aware of lost periods of time. They might claim that they're having blackouts, and those blackouts is basically when another personality takes over. So the disorder is going to be usually more prevalent in women than it would be in men. And women with dissociative identity disorder, they tend to have more identities than the men would possess. The average would be between 15 or more compared to men who may average only 8. So with the dissociative identity disorder, this is a controversial type of diagnosis. Some experts have suggested that many cases are usually faked or resulted from false memories and an unconscious need to please the therapist. And I have a great example for that. When I worked at Texas Youth Commission, I had a client that I was working with, a young man, who he actually had 2 psychologists working with him. He had myself, and then there was a contracted psychologist that was working with him as well. And the outside psychologist, she was relatively new, and she hadn't worked with individuals who knew how to malinger or utilize fictitious disorders. He had more of antisocial behaviors and conduct disorders, what this young man had been diagnosed with. However, in working with his other psychologists, he basically made her feel that she was working with someone with dissociative identity disorder, not realizing that this young man had got hold to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. He kind of read up on dissociative identity disorder, and he started giving her multiple personalities. And lo and behold, when we had a treatment team, a multidisciplinary treatment team, it was discussed at that time. And I'm like, oh, really? And she was like, well, yeah. And I was like, and he was able to share with you that he had multiple personalities? And she was like, yes, yes. And I was like, well, I'd like for us to meet with him together. And when we met with him, he kind of knew the jig was up, so to speak, as I was telling him, asking him about his multiple personalities. And then finally, it was where I asked him to give us the diagnostic statistical manual that he was able to take out of our offices, because pretty much I kind of knew that he was reading and using what he had. Needless to say, I felt bad for the new psychologist, because she just fell into play for it, and she was actually embarrassed, and I was like, nothing to be embarrassed about. It's a new experience in dealing with antisocial behaviors and dealing with malingerers, and it just gave her new experiences. So it was a good learning curve for her, and he had a good laugh from it, and he understood that eventually everything comes to light. And in terms of his claiming he had dissociative identity disorder, he realized that that did come to light. So hopefully that's a good explanation. But what I would like to say is that on the other side of that debate, there are psychologists who would accept the validity of dissociative identity disorder, and they're going to provide that treatment through treatment guidelines. Now, let's talk about personality a little bit. When we're talking about personality disorders, understand that this is the inflexible maladaptive traits that cause a significant impairment of social and occupational functioning. And with that, I want to also include that with personality disorders, these are those long-term disorders that I had mentioned about earlier, in terms of which it's helping a person learn how to cope with what the disorder is and how to handle it and work through it, rather than saying that there's a cure for it. Here, it's going to be much more difficult for an individual who presents with a personality disorder. So although there's like serial killers, they're often seen as classic example of antisocial personality disorder. And there's going to be many of those as sociopaths that would harm people in less dramatic ways. So think about it as an example of ruthless business people and crooked politicians. There are going to be 4 hallmarks of antisocial personality disorder, that being egocentrism. And egocentrism is there's a preoccupation with themselves, as well as having insensitivity to the needs of others. They don't really care about what you think. It's about them. There'll be a lack of conscience. It's whatever I want, and regardless of what you want, if I want this now, I'm going to take it, I'm going to get it. Impulsive behaviors, they'll act out and do whatever that comes to their mind then and there, as well as superficial charm. These individuals can charm the pants off of you, and you don't understand or know why you did that. They're very charismatic. Okay. There's been twin and adoption studies that help to suggest a potential for genetic predispositions for antisocial personality disorder. Biological contributions have also been able to suggest through investigations that there's an abnormally low autonomic activity during stressful times, particularly within the right hemisphere. And these abnormalities can reduce the gray matter within the frontal lobes, and then there's a biochemical disturbance as well. Evidence has also suggested that environmental factors as well as psychological causes can be influential in antisocial personality disorder. And it highly correlates with abusive parenting styles as well as inappropriate modeling that may occur. And always remember my mantra. I always say, never think of it as 100%. I don't want you to feel that every person that has antisocial personality disorder automatically had poor parenting. That's not always the case. But we have shown through research that the numbers are high. Okay? So with people with antisocial personality disorder, they do often come from homes that's characterized with having emotional deprivation. There's been harsh as well as inconsistent disciplinary behaviors. Um, and those practices can be from parental behaviors, including parents being antisocial. And then there's been other studies, though, that show the strong interaction between both hereditary as well as the environment. Now, borderline personality disorder is going to be one of the most commonly diagnosed personality disorders. And the core feature for this disorder basically is impulsivity as well as instability of one's mood, difficulties in relationships, as well as one's self-image. There's going to be a lot of distortions there for that person. Originally, this term implied that a person was on pretty much the borderline between neurosis and schizophrenia. And, excuse me, thinking of now, when we conceptualize it today, it's no longer really has this type of connotation. However, borderline personality do remain to be one of the most complex as well as debilitating forms of personality disorders. There are individuals with border personality disorders, they're going to see themselves as well as everyone in more absolute terms. They think black and white, okay? You're going to either be the best person in the world, perfect, or you're going to be worthless. You're no good. It's black and white. Bad, good, that's it. No in between. They'll constantly look for reassurance from others. They do want to have people connect, but they have difficulties doing it. And when things don't work out for these individuals, they'll erupt in anger instantly. I mean, at the slightest sign of disapproval, they will jump ship. You could be their best friend, but if you didn't agree with something that they were speaking about, now you, as far as they're concerned, you're the enemy, and they hate you. It's a definite sign. You can see a person with borderline personality disorder showing love and hate type relationships. They can love you until things don't work out for them, and then they'll cut you off right at the hip. So this disorder is also typically going to be marked by that long history of having broken friendships because of that kind of facet. They'll experience divorce, they experience loss of jobs, all due to these particular situations. Those with borderline personality disorder, they're frequently going to have childhood history of neglect. There might be emotional deprivation, physical, sexual, as well as emotional abuse occurring. With borderline personality disorder, it also tends to run within families. And research has shown that this impairment can be found within the frontal lobes of the brain, as well as in the limbic system. And these are the areas that help to control one's impulsive behavior. Some therapists have had success treating borderline personality disorder, but more than likely people with borderline personality disorder appear to have a deep well of intense loneliness. There's always a chronic fear of being abandoned. And unfortunately, given their troublesome personality traits, friends, lovers, and even family members, therapists often do feel abandoned, and thus it creates this tragic self-fulfilling prophecy. Doing therapy with these individuals have been quite difficult. It's taxing, and working with these individuals has been hard. I've been fortunate to work with some individuals, and I can say wholeheartedly that through training, even with all the training that I've received, that the complexities of their cases was lifelong for these individuals. And I've worked with some as a student that I had to then do termination, and when it came time for me to leave, that person actually demonstrated decompensating because they were doing well as long as I was there with them, but for them to have make a new connection was quite difficult, and they didn't understand that I was leaving because I was finished with school per se and moving away, but they saw it as me abandoning them and not caring for them anymore. So that gives you one example of how intense it can be. All right. So now it's time for you to take a look again. I would want you to just check your knowledge about abnormal behaviors altogether. All right. So there's going to be these 5 different vignettes, and I want you to think about in each vignette which is the possible diagnosis. Okay. Uh, and again, take time to look for the answers for yourselves in your textbook. Be sure to pause and read it clearly, and hopefully this will help you because in terms of the exam, you'll probably see a couple of mini vignettes that you'll have to answer that kind of question too. All right, so now we're going to move on and start speaking about gender and psychological disorders. So, research has been able to find considerable gender differences in the prevalence rates of various mental disorders. Let's start with the well-established fact that around the world, the rate of severe mental illness or depression, rather, for women is really double that of men. Okay, so why is there such a striking difference between genders? There are certain risk factors for depression, like the genetic predisposition, one having relational issues or marital problems, that being with pain or as well as medical illnesses, and they're common in both men and women. However, poverty has been known to be a well-known disorder, and women are far more likely to fall into the lowest social economic group. Women also tend to experience more sexual trauma. Uh, they'll have more partner abuse through domestic violence. There's going to be chronic stress in daily living. And these are all well-known contributing factors in depression. Okay? So, on the other hand, we have to also see that the most common symptom of depression, like crying, low energy, dejected facial expressions, the withdrawal from social activities, these are more socially acceptable for women. And the fact that gender differences in depression are more pronounced in cultures with traditional gender roles is also what would play a hand. And it suggests that male depression, it can be underdiagnosed because men are taught, to hide their feelings and to redirect their emotions. And that's typical in our society. Men are typically going to socialize or suppress their emotions, and they'll show their distress by acting out more. That being, they'll show more anger or aggression. They'll act more impulsive, like driving recklessly or, committing petty crimes. There'll be more substance abuse within men. Research has also suggested that there are some gender differences in depression that can actually relate to how women and men tend to, internalize or externalize their emotions. This been drawn from a national survey that included 43,000 of non-institutionalized people here in the United States. And the research was able to identify some internalizing versus externalizing patterns that really ties together previous research and may better explain these gender differences in mental disorders. So by using structured interview techniques, the research has been able to find that women would ruminate, and when I mean ruminate, I'm talking about hold on to something. It's like, say you got angry with someone and you held on to that anger for years. This is what we call ruminating. And it's found to be women would do more rumination than men. They're going to be more likely to focus repetitively on these internal negative emotions and the problems rather than engaging in more of the external problem, which, taking the problems and actually solving it and coming up with different strategies. While men, they tend to be more disinhibited, and then they're more likely to kind of externalize their emotions and problems. They're not going to put it on themselves and take it in and say, oh, it's my fault. They're going to find a reason outside to say why something might be occurring and happening. In terms of culture in psychological disorders, people of different cultures, they're going to experience mental disorders in a variety of different ways. So one example would be how there's been a reported incidence of schizophrenia that varies within different cultures all around the world. And it's really unclear whether these differences had resulted from actual differences in prevalence of the disorder, or are there differences, that's from definition or diagnosis or even the reporting of it. The symptoms of schizophrenia, it's going to be various across the different cultures, as so the particular stresses that may trigger its onset. Finally, you have to look at that despite the advanced treatment facilities that's available, as well as methods that's here in westernized cultures, prognosis for people with schizophrenia is actually going to be better in those non-industrialized societies. And we think it's due to the core symptoms of schizophrenia, that being poor rapport with others or incoherent speech and so on. It kind of makes it more difficult to survive in highly industrialized countries. Additionally, when we're looking at industrialized nations, families and other support groups, they're more individualized, so they're less likely to feel responsible for the relatives and friends that has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, most of the research that's on the psychological disorders, they kind of originate as well as conducted here more in Western cultures than the Eastern cultures. And there's this restricted sampling, so it limits our understanding about the disorders generally, and it leads to more of an ethnocentric type of view about mental disorders, which creates stigmas. Fortunately, though, through cross-cultural type of research, we have been able to devise different ways to try to overcome some of those difficulties. So excuse me, Robert Nishimito, and this is back in 1988, he kind of found that there's several cultural general type of symptoms that's useful in being able to diagnose disorders across the different cultures. He saw that several cultural bound symptoms, like for example, within the Vietnamese, Chinese cultures, it's been reported, it's been reported fullness of the head, whereas in the Mexican culture, respondents had problems with their, memory. In terms of Caucasians or Anglo-Americans, it's been more about saying shortness of breath or having headaches. So apparently people learn to express their problems in the ways that's accepted to others within their culture. Just as there's cultural bound and cultural general symptoms, it's been found that mental disorders are themselves sometimes culturally bound. And an earlier example would have been of talking about Canadian Indians and how it illustrated in that particular case. So here's just some of the cultural general symptoms that is displayed here on this particular slide. Some people might say that they're feeling nervous or they're having trouble sleeping. They may have low spirited. They may be weak all over, or Some would say they're having personal worries. In terms of the Hispanic or Latino culture, there would be those personal worries. They're going to have more of the psychosomatic feelings, whereas physicalities that they might discuss over. Um, so these are just 12 of those general symptoms that can be found amongst the various cultures. Some disorders are fading as remote areas become more westernized. That being, when we talk about anorexia, this has been spreading vast and been adopted more here in the Western cultures than in Eastern cultures. If you take a look of the slide, it's demonstrating and showing some of the different cultures and how it's being expressed as far as symptoms. As mentioned before with the Latino cultures, they call it the ataque de nervioso, attack of nerves. And they might, like I said, they'll show it more physically than speaking about mentally. As far as Southeast Asian, here the term running amok comes out. And it's where they're feeling out of control. They might feel like they're having the delusional thoughts, or they might be presenting with auditory hallucinations. West Africa is brain fag, and here is where they're feeling mentally tired and fatigued. They might have challenges with daily functioning. So, and the list go on. I would recommend going ahead and just taking a look, but it kind of gives you an idea about how each culture shows things a little differently than the next. This concludes psychological disorders.